Hey there, my name is Terry with Tree Marie Soapworks, and today we're going to switch gears and do a little arts and crafts. In my last video, I made a design in a 9-bar slab mold, and I asked you if you were interested in seeing how to make a soap mold out of a cardboard box, and I got a lot of feedback, so I'm going to show you that today. First, I'll show you what supplies you need, then I will help you figure out what size of mold you want to make. After that, I'll show you how to make the mold and the liner, and then finally, I will help you figure out how much soap batter to make in that mold, or more specifically, how much oils you will need to make that soap. I'll give you some formulas. If you normally make your own liners in whatever mold you use, at the end of the video I give you a tip on how to get that liner flat on the bottom and squared up on the corners and edges. Also, in my last video, I said I already have the soap made for my next video and it's gorgeous, and I just scooted this one in between because it uses a 9-bar slab mold as well. And if you want to see a little sneak peek of that soap, stay tuned to the end of the video. Alright, let's get started. First, I used a piece of paper and a pencil, a ruler, a box cutter, a Sharpie or a permanent marker, some glue, a rubber band, and this is a big rubber band, clothespins or some kind of clamps or clips, weights, and I used walking weights. You can use cans of soup or just something heavy, packaging tape, masking tape, scissors. A calculator is optional if you need it. Also, you will need a mat to cut on or just a piece of cardboard, something to protect your surface, and whatever box you decide to use, and also you'll need some freezer paper and some corrugated cardboard. Please note that the freezer paper has to be freezer paper. Wax paper and parchment paper don't work for this. It's got that plastic coated side that helps it to release from the mold, and it's also a little more sturdy than those other papers. Today I'm making a 9-bar slab mold, so I need to figure out what the length and width of 9 of my bars side by side would be. So I'm measuring my bar and I'm going to go ahead and draw that up on paper. This is where you make it whatever size you want. Then you can take this paper and walk around the house or the store and try to get it closest to the size that is ideal for you. For this one, I'm marking every 3.5 inches on one direction and then every 2.25 inches in the other direction. Since this is just a flat piece of paper, I also have to think about the thickness of the box I'm looking for. Normally when I make soap in a slab mold, I'm using it lying down or flat or only about an inch of thickness, but occasionally I will make soap like my marble soap that I made in my marble soap video, and that was standing up, and so that was kind of like two loaves side by side. So when I think about the thickness of my slab molds, I usually like to allow for making a standing up bar in that same slab. I'm looking for something a little bit bigger than the height of my normal bar of soap standing up. So that would be 2.25 or so plus a little bit. So I'm looking for something at least 2.5 inches thick. Now that I have the ideal mold size drawn up, I just cut off the excess and then I just go around and find a box. And the box that I found was this family size Cheez-Its box. You can see that the box is a little different than my ideal size, but it's pretty close. It's longer on one side and shorter in the other side, so that kind of evens out and it will be fine. I also make sure that the height of it is the right height and a little bit bigger than my bar height. To prepare the box, glue the open end shut. Start by gluing the short flaps and then glue the very edge of the long flap that will be the flap that is on the underneath side. I did not show that part here, but I ended up doing that and it made it a lot more sturdy. And then just put some weight on there and let it sit for a good 15-20 minutes to dry out. Next, mark and cut the depth of the mold you want. I'm making mine a little bit bigger than my bar, so I'm making it 2.5 inches. Next, make sure that your knife is very sharp and that you are very careful, of course, when you're cutting. I find that it is easier to score the surface a few times along the ruler and then to try to cut through, because if I try to cut through a lot at once, a lot of times it ends up pushing the ruler and I get off track. So score it a few times and then cut through, and don't worry about the corners where it overlaps. There's some places where there's two thicknesses. In those spots, just use your scissors to cut that after you're done cutting with the knife. Check the flaps where the two layers overlap and glue any parts that need glued down, and then remove any excess glue and just use your clips to clamp them down. While that's drying, we can go ahead and cut some strips of cardboard to reinforce the mold. The height of the mold is 2.5 inches, so we'll need 4 strips. And then we'll just cut the long length of the mold, and that measures 9 3/4 inches. For this to really maximize the strength, we need that corrugation to run lengthwise, the long width of the mold. Here I'm marking every 2.5 inches, and then I will go ahead and cut that into 4 strips. Next I got 2 of these in the 9 3/4 inch measurement that I found from the long side of the mold. Then I remove the clamps and I glue the reinforcements on and clamp those down. Next, measure the length of what those other 2 strips are going to be. For mine, they ended up being 7 1/4 inches. Next, cut those, glue them on, and then clamp them down. I used a rubber band here, but you can use more clamps or whatever you have on hand. Next, I measure the length and width of the bottom, and I cut that out of the corrugated cardboard. It doesn't really matter which direction the corrugation is on this. Just mark it, cut it, and glue it down, and then set some waste in your mold so that it adheres properly. Next, I'll show you how to figure out the size of your freezer paper. So you just add up the height of the side, the width of the bottom, and the height of the side, and then how much you want it to extend over the edge for each edge. For this one, I used 2.5 inches plus 9.75 inches plus 2.5 inches, and then the overhang is a total of 1.5 inches. That equals 16.25 inches, and that's the width of the long side of my freezer paper. Next, we use that same formula, but in the other direction. So we use 2.5 plus 7 plus 2.5 and plus that 1.5 overlap, which equals 13.5. Now we know that the size of the freezer paper is going to be 16.25 by 13.5, and we just cut that out. We mark it on the side that's not shiny. This freezer paper is 18 inches wide, so I just measured up enough to get the 13.5 measurement, and then the 16.25 measurement will go in the other direction. I'm measuring the 16.25 inch measurement first because I know that that edge is straight. Next I'm going to cut that and then square up the other edge that was just cut with the scissors, and then I will measure that to the 13.5 and cut that. Here I'm using the lines on the mat to help me square up the edge. To figure out where the first creases will be, we'll just add up the height of the mold and the extension amount. So that would be 2.5 plus 0.75 equals 3.25. Please note that I don't measure this every time. I usually just have my paper cut to the proper size. I cut a bunch of them and then I just eyeball it. I hold my paper over the mold. I just see where my first crease is going to be and I go from there. Here I'm just showing you how to get it centered. Make sure that the shiny side of the liner is to the inside. Now that I have the first two creases made, I use the mold as a guide and I slide the freezer paper all the way in and make a crease. Then I turn the paper 180 degrees and make a crease at the other end of that line so that that line stays true. Next I turn the mold and I do the same thing on the other side. Once you're done with those creases, slide that into the mold and make sure everything fits well. Next I'll show you how to tape this to make it watertight. Take a corner and pivot it 45 degrees and just crease the inner crease. Tape that from the top to the bottom just to make sure it's watertight. Then repeat that on the other three corners. When I make my own molds, I like to note what size of freezer paper I use to line it. That way there's no guesswork the next time, or it doesn't take me time to add up the measurements. I also like to write down where the first creases are on the first two sides. If you're planning on using this mold a lot, I would suggest covering it with packaging tape, especially in the area where you're going to tape the liner to the mold. Next, slide the liner into the mold and cut the corners down to where it meets the mold. Then tape your mold in place. But before you do that, I have a tip that I learned. So let's go right to the what I learned section. Even though I was trying to get that liner down into the corners and into the edges of the mold, I didn't really succeed on that, and I want to show you something that I came up with to help get those corners nice and sharp and help your soap not to be rounded on the bottom. Here's the soap that I made when I used this mold. It came out beautifully, but when I took the soap out of the liner, the bottom was rather rounded, and I planed it off once, and you can see that it is still rounded on the edges. So I came up with a little tip that will be good for anybody that uses freezer paper liners. Find something around your house that has a nice 90-degree edge and a 90-degree corner, and make sure it's not rounded. And I thought maybe a lot of you, if you have kids, you have Legos, but use whatever you have around the house. Of course, make sure it's sanitized before you put it in your mold. And then just nestle it down into the corner of your mold and into the edges of your mold and make those creases for the inner edge of your mold and the outer edge of your mold. Next, just pop your liner out of your mold and give those crease lines a good fold to fix them in place. I noticed that there's a good 1/8 of an inch difference in where I creased the liner before, so that'll make a lot of difference in the flatness of the bottom of the soap. When you're finished with the creasing, pop the liner back into the mold and use that Lego to make sure that the liner is seated in the edge and in the bottom of the mold. As you go around the edge of the mold with the Lego, tape down the outside edge of the liner with masking tape. Next, I'm going to give you some formulas that you can use to figure out your oil so that you can just plug that number into SoapCalc. The first is if you're using inches and ounces, you need to take length times width times height and then times 0.4. I use 0.42 because I find that's a little more accurate when I'm using my water discount. If you're using centimeters and grams, use length times width times height times 0.7. And again, if you're using a higher water discount, you can make that 0.72. Another way to figure out the oil weight is by the bar, and this is actually what I normally use. So I know that my bars usually contain 3.35 ounces of oils. And then for this mold, it's 9 bars, so you just take the 3.35 times 9 and you get 30.15. You might ask how I know that my bars contain 3.35 ounces of oils. It's because I normally make my bars in a 10-bar loaf mold, and that oil amount is 33.5. So when I break that down, divide it by 10, it's 3.35. So that's easy for me to just take that 3.35 times however many bars I'm going to use. So if I have my small loaf mold that's only 4 bars, I just take that 3.35 times 4. Or if I have my 8-bar tall and skinny mold, I know that I'll just take that 3.35 times 8. So it makes it pretty easy. I hope you learned something today, and if you'd like to see more Tree Marie videos like this, please hit the like button. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them below. I really enjoy reading through them, and I do my best to answer them. And here's a preview for the next video. If you want to receive notifications, please make sure you're subscribed and then hit the bell and hit all notifications. Thank you so much for joining me today, and I will see you here next time.